And good afternoon to you all who are with us now. Guest in our webinar series on leaders in research. We hosted in the past very prestigious people like Israel Uman, a Nobel laureate. Also less famous people, but very good researchers. Everything is available on our YouTube. And today, it is my pleasure to host in this series Professor David Wisborg from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, not only George Mason University at the US, and one of the most productive researchers that I ever met, with almost 42,000 citations in Google Scholars, hundreds of papers, over 35 books. David is a force of nature, as we call it. This is something, in a way, which is a bit frustrating, David. You know why? Because every few months I get this list of new papers by David Wisbord, and I'm asking myself, what's going on? He did 6 more papers, 5 more papers, and on it gets. So you are exceptional, and you are exceptional researcher. We'll speak about the content in a minute, and we'll ask you to present, and we'll ask you clarification questions. But I'd like to start with the question, what drives you? Are you aware that you are exceptional in this sense? Do you ask yourself, what makes you so motivated, so serious about your work, and you're not dispressing yourself. You have your 3 main issues, and you go with them for many years now. How can we understand it? What can we learn from you, David?
Yeah, it's interesting, early in my career, and we agreed that I would speak in English. But before I start, actually, I'd like to say, להודות לדוד. אני כל כך מעריך אותך על המאמצים שלך לתמוך בדוקטורנטים, בפוסט-דוקטורנטים באוניברסיטה העברית. זה לא מובן מאליו. אתה אחד מהחוקרים האקטיביים ביותר והמצליחים ביותר באוניברסיטה, ושאתה נותן את הזמן שלך היקר לעבודה הזאת, זה כל כך יפה, ואני מודה לך, אני חושב בשם האוניברסיטה.
אני מאוד מעריך את זה.
And let me just say that I decided we would speak in English because English is the language of my research. It's also the language I think in. So I think if people want to get insights into research, it'll be better in English. And my students tell me this group English is a okay language to use. So I think that when you ask about what motivates, I think that what I tell my students about this is every few years, you've got to think about what do you want to accomplish? Like what's next? What would you really like to do next? And I find myself every X number of years turning and say, well, this is what I accomplished. But what's the next question? What's the problem here? You'll see in the presentation I gave that a lot of my work is developing research, then saying, well, wait a minute, there's a problem here. How do I solve that particular problem? How do I advance it in a certain way? Although I've done work in a number of different areas, there's a small group of areas around, we call the criminology of policing and others where my major focus has been. I find myself at this later part of career to be as excited, if you like, about what I'm doing as when I was younger, maybe in some ways, perhaps more.
No, but you were like this always as a student, as a pupil in the high school, task-oriented, concentrated, highly motivated?
No, actually in high school I wasn't highly motivated at all, I don't think. I was much more interested in other things. And in college, really, I began to be very motivated by academic work.
So
And
it was Brandeis for you, which made the difference.
yeah,
Can you
Brandeis had,
can you
go ahead.
tell us about your first interaction with research and the figures that shaped your academic career moving to Yale later on?
That's interesting. I found myself very interested in many things that other people didn't seem to be interested in, reading a lot of books and spending a lot of time on my academic work. And I just found it I was interested. And when I was an undergraduate, one faculty member at Brandeis, who never got tenure, who actually passed away at a relatively young age, he was very interested in and I'm blanking on his name right now. It's been a long time, but
I don't
he
hear you
was.
well. Can you please try to speak more to the microphone?
I don't know why that's happening. Can you hear me now?
A little bit better.
Okay. So there was a faculty member in sociology at Brandeis, and he had this idea of the way in which conflict unified people. And I found that fascinating. I wrote my graduate thesis, which was, I think, 200 pages long on that topic. So yeah, it was, I was inspired by thinking about it. Actually, after I finished college, I went to law school first. And I, because at the time, both my parents, my brothers, and others said, what are you going to do? You got to go to law, either it's law school or medicine or something of this sort. And so I went to law school for a year, and I was really interested in law school. But all the other students were very interested in, like at that time, people were ripping pages out of books, so you couldn't read the cases. People were interested in making money and careers, and I was very interested in the material. And then I decided, after speaking to some people, I really belonged in a PhD program, which is how I got to Yale in a sense. And in a sense, I also concentrated on issues of social control, law, and deviance because I'd spent that year in law school.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Let me ask the audience, do you hear well, or is it only my problem? You hear well. I see. So, Galit. So. Well, so some of the people hear well.
I'm as close as I can get without being on the screen now.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me now? All right, Galit says yes. Okay.
Okay, good. So let's try to keep remembering that and so on. So last time I saw you face to face was in the ceremony for new members who joined the Israeli academia, and their
Israel Academies of Science, right?
Israeli Academy of Science,
Academia
and
Israelית
presented a very short summary of your major contribution, and asked you to present extended version of that year. So 2025, 2024, you joined the Israeli Academy of Sciences, and I was so happy to see you there among the other members. I thought, maybe how come so late? It should have been 10 years ago, 10 years before. But we leave it to another opportunity and give you the floor and ask you to present your major contributions from this talk.
I'll tell you, it's a thing of academia and science. Academics always think things come too late, right? It never happens when you want it to happen. And it's very discouraging, I think, for young academics who, work really hard to get tenure and this sort of thing. So in my career, I've said, you should be happy when things happen. There are structural reasons why things happen. The best prize in the world, there are a bunch of people who are eligible. And so I think you should be happy when I won the Stockholm Prize or the Israel Prize or the Rothschild Prize or the Sutherland Award, be happy when it happens, if it happens. I will note that there are structural things like the Israel Academy. The way members are normally elected is by nomination of members. And since there's never been a criminologist in the society, that made my membership a little bit more difficult. They've now expanded their views, I think, a bit. But anyway, I was happy to be there too. So you asked me to speak for a few minutes. Now I have to share my screen. Let's see, it squares. Okay.
Excellent.
So David asked me to speak for 20 minutes. So I've done I focus on a lot of different areas in criminology, but my major contribution over time has been on what some people call the criminology of place or crime in place, the introduction of the idea of a sort of new way of thinking about the crime problem. So let me begin by saying, for those non-criminologists, that in the 20th century, there were two main sort of units of analysis around which we thought about the crime problem. One was poshim, individuals, criminals, and the other was shchunot, areas, delinquency areas, large parts of town. On the left-hand side, you have a figure that's 100 years old by a book by Thrasher, a sociologist at the University of Chicago. That's the area he thought the gangs developed from. But when I was finishing my doctorate, and I needed to have a regular job, I worked for a year at the Vera Institute of Justice, and my obligation was to do an evaluation of a new pilot community policing program. And though a lot of my work had been quantitative, this evaluation was qualitative. I walked the street with cops 4 days a week. There were 9 police officers. Each of them was assigned a beat. You can see the beats here. These beats were considered the really bad parts of town. By the way, in a precinct in New York at the time, as Malcolm Gladwell writes when talking about my work, that was considered very, very problematic. But these are the 9 beats, if you like, or these are areas where we assumed that crime was spread throughout these areas. In, similar to the way the Chicago School and criminologists in the 19th and 20th century thought about place. And even I walked the street with these police officers 4 days a week. Their job was to walk the streets and deal with crime problems. And I thought we'd be spending our time in all the streets in these beats. And it turned out we spent our time in just a single street or 2 streets. We kept going back again and again and again. And at the time, I thought of these places as small worlds of crime. But eventually my colleagues and I began to call it hotspots of crime, which has become a rather common phrase, at least among criminologists. So having observed that early on, as I began to develop my career, I tried to develop some visualizations or some data that would help us with this. And I did a bunch of smaller studies. But then in the 1990s, I received 2 large grants from the National Institute of Justice to examine crime in the city of Seattle. We had about almost 2 million crime incidents over 14 years. And we attached those crime incidents to street segments, intersection to intersection. The street segment in my work, I won't go into it now, is I look at it as a type of micro community, a small community, if you like, with many of the same characteristics of larger communities. People interact with each other. They know their routines. They have a lot to do with each other on both sides of the street, etc. So I was able to get data for 14 years from Seattle, and I mapped that data with colleagues. And this shows you one of the first results. Between 1989 and 2002, about 50% of the crime...
אמרתי לך, אני בזום עם דיוויד.
שמחה, אתה צריך לשים אותך במיוט.
אוקיי.
טוב לראות אותך. Anyway, so what we found was 50% of the crime every year from 1989 to 2002 is found at 5% of the street segment. Now, here was, in a sense, part of what I found when I was walking the streets with cops in the 72nd precinct in Brooklyn. But I guess I hadn't thought it would be so concentrated, if you like, and so consistent over time. And then a few years later, I had data from 2 other cities, one Tel Aviv, and we looked at almost 20,000 crime incidents in about 15,000 streets. And what do we find? Again, 50% of the crime is at 5% of the streets. Now, Seattle and Tel Aviv are not very much alike. 25% of the crime, by the way, was at 1% of the streets. And then about the same time, I had data from New York through a grant from the Soros Foundation. And if you look at the right side of the screen, you can see that 5% of the streets in New York City produce, or street segments produce 52% of the crime. And 1% produce about 25% of the crime. Now, eureka. It was like being in a bathtub, like the philosopher. And I looked at that and said, wow, it's not just that crime is concentrated at micro-geographies in cities. It's also this concentration seems to be within a very small bandwidth. And that concentration I characterized in an article I wrote in Criminology. That's actually my Sutherland address to the American Society of Criminology as the law of crime concentration. Here you can see for the article I had now, 6 cities. There's a very small bandwidth. About 5% of the streets in the city produce 50% of crime. A little more than 1% produce 25%. Now, I noted before in Seattle that there seemed to be a lot of consistency over time, and that's what this graph shows you, this figure. Look at the upper right of the figure. You have the city of Seattle that I showed you before, but what's interesting is, though year to year for 16 years here, about 50% of the crime is found at just 5% of the streets, about 1%, about 25% of the crime at 1%, pretty consistently. Yet crime declined in Seattle by about 20 to 25% during that period. So there is consistency in crime concentrations when there's a strong variability in crime rates. Now, an important question that comes, you can start thinking about the implications of these findings. You know, crime is very concentrated in a small number of places. That obviously creates some type of idea, well, maybe we should be concentrating crime prevention resources as well. But an important question is it just stochastic? Is this just regression to the mean, for example? Each year does 5% of the streets produce 50% of the crime, but year to year, that's a different group of streets. Well, this is based on the 2 million crime incidents I told you about from Seattle. And it's a trajectory analysis, a group-based trajectory analysis. It's a statistical technique that allows you to group events over time, or group, in this case, street segments, to group street segments according to their crime rates over time. And you can see a line all the way at the top. It's that red line. That's the 1% of the streets that produce 25% of the crime consistently in Seattle. So, while it's not always the same streets, there's a relative stability. Hotspots of crime tend to be hot year to year. Now, as you think about what I observed in the 72nd precinct, one of the things I observed was not just there are hotspots, but like even in a bad area of town, this delinquency area, most of the streets don't seem to have many crime problems. And this is a visualization of that from southern Seattle. And the right-hand side is sort of the bad area of town, if you like. And in this case, the streets with very little crime are thin light lines, and the streets, the hotspots, like the high chronic hotspots, are dark, thick lines. And as you can see in this supposedly, crime-ridden area, the way people thought about it, most of the streets have relatively little crime. There's hotspots in a bunch of places, but most of the streets have either no or very little crime. When the mayor of Seattle saw this work in a book called The Criminology of Place, he said that we have to start calling this area of town the most diverse areas of the city and stop associating every street with crime. Now, this is the northern part of Seattle. And this is the nice part of town, especially on the left, sort of northern parts of the city. Mountains, great views of the ocean, lakes. And here what's interesting is that if you had started with the delinquency area idea, the Chicago school idea, then you wouldn't have really thought about what you can notice here, which is there are a bunch of hot spots in this part of town. In other words, many of the streets in the parts of town that we see as crime-ridden don't have any crime. Most of them don't. And the streets on the good part of town, there are a bunch of streets that have a lot of crime. So I think this points to the initial ideas I had about this, and I was able to illustrate it as time went on. By the way, if you look at the University of Washington, on the lower right-hand side, you can see there's lots of crime around the University of Washington. Well, maybe it's not the graduate students that are doing that, but nonetheless, it's interesting. Okay. The fact that when we looked at crime over time, crime rates over time, that we found the hotspots tended to be stable, the same places over a 16-year period, suggests an idea that's important to my work and important to the policy implications, which is that crime is coupled to place. In other words, there's a reason why certain places have a lot of crime. This is from a study I did of juvenile crime hotspots. Trajectories or groups 6, 7, 8, those are the hottest juvenile crime streets. And you can see those streets are very likely to have shops, malls, restaurants, schools, and youth centers. In other words, they're the places where kids hang out. Not surprising that, that those are the hotspots of juvenile crime. And I could go on for a bit with this, but we don't have time. But this is also from the Seattle work. We tried to explain why hotspots of crop, why a street is a hotspot. We had longitudinal data, so we were able to do this in a slightly better causal framework than cross-sectional data. And as you can see, a lot of the reasons make good sense. In other words, you have employees in the block, you're more likely to have be a hotspot of crime. If there are more residents, more people, more opportunities. High-risk juveniles about, that creates opportunities as well. But it's also interesting that we found that a measure we had of collective FC, and this has been found now in 3 papers I've written on this with different data. Collective FC is a measure of informal social control. So this social measure, in a sense, whether citizens are cohesive with each other and willing to intervene, also has a strong and significant effect on whether a place is a crime hotspot. So an important part of my work has been public policy. I'm very interested in basic research. I had a large NIH R01 grant for basic research on crime hotspots, for example. But I'm very interested in the implications of this. It seems to me that if we can improve society, makes things safer, et cetera, that would be a good thing. But my work, as I've already sort of implied, has some simple policy implications. If crime is found at specific places, then you ought to be focusing your crime prevention efforts at those places. If those places are stable over time, that's a good reason to believe that if you focus your efforts, you'll actually have some crime prevention effect and not just move crime around the corner. But I wanted to look at that partially because early in my career, when I did the 72nd Precinct study, there was a general view among criminologists the police couldn't prevent crime. To be frank, until the early work my colleagues and I did on crime hotspots, there was basically little rigorous evidence the police could prevent crime. As David Bailey says, experts know, they know, the police and experts know they can't prevent a crime, yet they pretend they do. Nonetheless, there was this assumption. And my again, early observations in the 72nd Precinct said to me, if the police come to the places where there's a lot of crime, they can have some positive impact. The first large study I did on that was with Lawrence Sherman, who went to Cambridge University eventually. He was at the University of Maryland, I believe, when we did this work. Anyway, Larry and I ran a large randomized trial in which we identified 110 hotspots in Minneapolis. We had cooperation from a very innovative police leader. And what we did was, the police leader did was focus police when they weren't doing other things on the crime hotspots. And we hope to get 2 to 3 times the normal dosage at the treatment hotspots. This is a randomly allocated study. So if you look on the right, you'll see a simple figure. From December through July, the police were able to do that, to bring about 2 to 3 times the amount of police patrol to the treatment hotspots as the control hotspots were getting. And mind you, in these hotspots, there are hundreds of crime calls a year sometimes. So there were police coming to these places. We just wanted to increase that amount dramatically. And what you can see here is during the period we were able to do that, between December and July, we had a crime prevention outcome. This was very important at the time. It's one of the first rigorous studies of policing to show that police could have an impact in crime. In this case, about a 20% decline in the treatment hotspots. Now, what happened during the summer? Well, the kids got out of school and the cops went on vacation. So basically, the experiment broke down because there weren't enough police around. There were many more calls for the police. Now, since we did this study, there have been more than 70 quasi-experimental and experimental studies, evaluations of hotspots policing. In a systematic review using an innovative measure, Anthony Braga and I found that overall there was about a 16% decline in crime across this large number of studies. The National Academy of Sciences has twice argued that hotspots policing is an evidence-based policing strategy for reducing crime. Of course, you might say to me, quickly, you might say, hey, but it's the case that doesn't crime just move around the corner? Doesn't, you plop down in a hotspot, doesn't just come around the corner? And this was a study we did in Jersey City. It wasn't randomized, but it was highly controlled. And what you're looking at is observations of prostitution activities and drug activities at two hotspots. They weren't single streets. There were multiple groups of streets where these problems were centered. And you can see that the focus on the hotspots led in the target area, the blue line, to a very significant and quick declines in levels of prostitution and activities in one spot and drug activities in the other. And it wasn't the case that around the corner things just went up. The red line and the green line are 1 block around and 2 block around catchment areas. And indeed, what happens is that when you focus on the hotspot, you get crime prevention benefits also in the areas around. And this finding has been confirmed. It's not that there's never displacement, but overall, when you carry out intelligent crime prevention, you tend to get what we call a diffusion of crime control benefits. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to note that one of the criticisms of, and David asked me about my career before, and questions come up and I want to answer them. So one important question was, well, when you focus police on a specific place, that can lead to problems as well. There are unintended consequences of policing. People might get stopped that shouldn't get stopped. The police might not behave well, and these sorts of things. So we ran recently, this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we ran a 3-city procedural justice policing experiment. In each city, we had 40 hotspots of violent crime and drug crime. We randomly allocated those 40 in each city to a treatment and control condition, the cops in the treatment condition. And we also randomly allocated units so that the hotspots would get treatment by a hotspots policing unit, but the treatment sites, hotspots policing units, received 5 days of training in procedural justice. And as you can see, when that happened, they not only behaved better to the public, which is the left side of the screen, they also were less likely to be seen by citizens as harassing or mistreating people on their block. And to be frank, they were also seen as less violent. There were fewer arrests in the treatment group, but crime went down about 14%. And what I conclude for that is, if you do this right, you can not only reduce crime, you can get a better reduction in crime, and also by focusing on respect. Procedural justice is giving people a voice, showing them respect, showing trustworthy motives and neutrality, that if you focus on these things with hotspots policing units, you'll improve hotspots policing and get, in a sense, advanced police reform. Now, I'm not going to say hardly anything about this, which is I think there are non-enforcement implications of my work. And these implications really are, you should be focusing on other sorts of interventions at crime hotspots, not only the police, because these places have lots of different types of problems. And one reason I believe that would be effective relates to the National Institute of Health study that I told you about, that I noted before. We found in that study that people who lived on the hotspots, the hottest hotspots, tended not to trust their neighbors.
I lost you. I don't know if the others hear you. Maybe it's my problem. I will wait patiently.
David, did you want to? Okay. We're writing a book on, focuses on this idea of social factors of crime hotspots and using social intervention to do something about it. In any event, I think I got exactly 20 minutes. Location, location, location. My work is about moving that. If you want to think about the crime problem, looking at micro-geographic places, it's important not only in real estate, but also in crime.
Excellent. Let me put myself as well in the spotlight for everyone, and you, of course, and thank you all for your patience. And now to questions. Would this location effect would also be applicable to white crime or only to fiscal violent crime? So what's the connection between your white crime research and location?
Look, to some degree, there are some types of white-collar crime that are not very white-collar. For example, bad checks, stealing checks from mailboxes. And these kind of things, I suppose, are likely, I don't have data on this, to be physically, geographically focused. But another way to think about this is that, the idea of concentration is not new. The Pareto principle suggests that economic activities are highly concentrated. We did something with cybercrime in which we looked at grooming, cyber grooming, and we found that a very small group of sites are responsible for most of the grooming. I suspect as well that you'll find that there are certain, actually there have been studies about this, there are certain, in certain industries, certain businesses are hotspots of crime. Certain types of industries tend to be hotspots of crime when regulation is low, etc. So I think that the idea of concentration will work across white-collar crime and other sorts of crime, but you have to think a bit differently because physical space may not be the space you're interested in.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the question regarding your work on white crime more generally. So your location or hotspot study starts with your PhD, but you still manage to do a contribution to the white-collar crime. And my question to you is, what was this kind of contribution? What is your the best ideas coming from the white crime research? And how did you manage to keep working on the hotspot stuff for so many years while making contribution on white crime?
Yeah, I think early in my career, I focused a good deal more on the white-collar crime work, maybe for the first 10 years.
Can you raise your voice, please?
Yeah, early in my career, I worked in particular on the white-collar crime work. I've done less of that now, though I'm actually involved in a project at the moment. Look, in white-collar crime, I think there are two major contributions that we made. The first large study I did was with Stan Wheeler and colleagues. Stan Wheeler was a professor at Yale Law School, one of my mentors. And after that, I worked with Elin Waring and other colleagues and followed up. The study we had at Yale was the largest study at the time ever done on white-collar crime. We had pre-sentence investigations from across the United States and focused in certain types of crimes in 7 judicial districts. When we studied white-collar crime, what we found out was that much of white-collar crime is very mundane. The image that lawyers who wrote about this for the most part had was a multi-million-dollar frauds in banks and large antitrust violations. But it turned out that most white-collar offenders prosecuted in the U.S. federal courts were from the middle classes. So we called a book that was published by Yale Press that I was first author of, and Stan was second, that we called it Crimes of the Middle Classes. In other words, to push the emphasis that white-collar crime is often mundane. Now, a second contribution in this area that we followed up later with a grant from the National Institute of Justice was we followed up the offenders who were prosecuted during the period in late 1970s that we had data on, and we followed their criminal careers. And there was also an assumption at the time that white-collar criminals didn't have criminal careers. It turned out that's not true. I think about 40-some-odd% of white-collar criminals that were studied had prior criminal records before the point that brought them into the study. They had different sorts of criminal careers. Some white-collar offenders had criminal careers like active street criminals, where they were involved in lots of different things, a lot of petty kind of white-collar crimes quite often. But then there was another group that was involved in larger crimes, but was very selective about it. Didn't happen every year. And there was a group that was one-off. But anyway, I think those are the two major approaches. I'm working with someone at the University of Miami now. We're trying to do a study in which we follow up the white-collar offenders in the 1970s till now. I assume many of them are dead, by the way. But we can get a lifelong view of how their criminal careers progressed.
Yeah. Going from white crime, from location to white crime, now you made a major contribution on, say, experimental criminology. And when I say experimental criminology, it can be more field experiments, but also lab experiments. Can you tell us what attracted your attention to the method, what you were able to do with it, and what are the limits, and how do you see the field developing in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. In my graduate school training, I had basically no training in experimental methods, which I think was common at very good sociology departments at the time. Really, I was very interested in statistics, and if you're interested in statistics, you can't help but think about experimental work as well. So I did read a bit. But when Larry Sherman and I were doing the Minneapolis Hotspots experiment, we had a conversation in which we said, look, no one believes the police can have an effect on crime. If anyone's going to believe us, we better use a method that has a lot of causal credence. That this is the method that's used to validate medical procedures and treatments, etc. So at that time, I learned an awful lot about randomized trials very, very quickly. And I think we made the right decision, because when we gained our results, it was a randomized trial. Now, at the time, most people thought you couldn't do a randomized trial like that in a large police agency. We were randomly allocating, to some extent, the entire police force. When I went out once to Minneapolis, they captured me like a group of patrol officers. They were going to bring me to the gym and have a talk with me, because they couldn't believe that we were telling them where to go. They wanted to go where they wanted to go. But anyway, so in a sense, I became interested in experimental methods, because those methods provide a very strong way of developing causal evidence on public policies. And I think that in the area of policing, where I've had, I think, a good deal of impact in this regard, there's now a view that experiments are possible in policing. It's possible to do them in ethical ways and in ways that can be actually accomplished. But it also brought me into communication with a group of other researchers in criminology and related fields who felt that it was time for experiments to take a more central role. Now I've written an article in which I talk about the moral imperative for randomized trials, because a lot of people think there are ethical issues in randomized trials, and there can be sometimes. But the other ethical problem is that when we provide answers to policy questions, we need to provide the best answers we can. We need to say when a program works, that it actually looks like it does work, or when it doesn't work or it backfires, we need to be able to tell people about that. So my view was there are very strong reasons to try to do randomized trials when it's possible.
Now, you were trained as a sociologist, but thereafter, I think you focused on criminology. The connection to the social sciences seems from afar, from my point of view, is some disconnect institutionally, where the journals are, which journals you criminologists are publishing and so on. What is the future of criminology, say, in 20, 30 years? Still a discipline on its own, island on its own? I might be wrong here, you can correct here, or part of the social sciences, or central part of the social sciences, more collaboration. What is needed to make criminology and social science to thrive?
Look, this is an argument among criminologists, I think. Criminology essentially mainstream criminology grew out of sociology, really. The Chicago School of Sociologists in the early 20th century. So early criminologists, many of them were sociologists. When I trained at Yale, there were a group of sociologists like Albert Rees and Stanton Wheeler that were interested in crime and also considered themselves criminologists, were active in the American Society of Criminology. Over time, criminology broke a bit from sociology, in part because people from other fields were becoming interested. Psychologists, economists, a whole slew of other disciplines began to be interested. Now, where it's going in that regard, I think at Hebrew U, there was a time when there was a discussion of whether criminology at Hebrew U should be in a law school or should be in social science. And I did a review at the time of criminology programs around the world. In the United States, criminology programs tended to be in social science or independent schools. In Europe, they tended to be in law schools. And I think criminology can succeed in many of those different places. It's not a good idea I think seeing criminology within the social sciences is not a bad idea. And I think there are good reasons for that. But it's a mistake to pigeonhole criminology within a specific discipline like sociology, because it may be that the core, we're trying to understand a phenomenon here. And it may be that the best ways to understand it may include economic as well as medical or social. I've been doing research in the National Institutes of Health. I'm doing a study now in epigenetics. So what I like about criminology is that it's a multidisciplinary discipline, if you like, that brings together people from different fields. But at the same time, a discipline has to have a core. Criminology has developed that core over the last 20 years. Whether that will continue or not, we'll see. But I think that criminology needs to be a discipline that draws from other disciplines.
Thank you for this. I'd like to move to another subject, is the research student and how to train research students. What are your lessons or advice to research students? What not to do as a mentor, advice to other mentors in the audience. Can you share your experience of being a mentee, a PhD students, but also later on supervisor, mentor for dozens of PhD students? So this is an open question. Please share with us your views on the PhD training, the student training, and the process of becoming an influential, useful researcher.
Yeah, I've had over 40 PhDs in my career.
40.
More like 45. Many of them have gone on to be important criminologists. Antti Braga won the Vollmer Award. Many of the most important police scholars in the world, from Australia to Canada to the US to Europe, have trained with me. So, and I'm very, very proud of that. And I think the essence of being a good mentor is that you get nachas from the achievements of your students. I think a good mentor is someone who doesn't only care about themselves, but wants to see their students do well. And then when they do well, it makes them really happy. Like, I won the American Society of Criminology's mentoring award, like the third person to get this. And like, I love that award. Like, I was very proud of it. I started putting it in all my statements. It's not the Sutherland Award for Science, the Israel Prize, the Rothschild Prize, the Stockholm Prize, or whatever, but in terms of scientific contribution. But yeah, I think the key for good mentoring is really about getting pleasure out of the achievements of your students, about caring about what happens to them, about worrying about how they're going to do in their careers, about thinking of their careers when they're assigning authorship or when they're developing research projects. It's a matter of being generous. I think there's a good trait for chairs of departments and deans and others as well. You'll be good at it if you get pleasure out of what they achieve. Being good at it is helping them achieve.
Yeah. What can you tell to the PhD students who are struggling or wants to be better? want to succeed? Any advice for them?
Yeah, it's very hard, academic careers. Academia is not an easy place, not only for students, but for faculty as well. You might ask, how are people that have lifetime positions and can't be fired, how come so many of them are very grumpy? You know, I mean, it's a hard career. You're always being criticized. There are lots of smart people competing for a very small amount of resources. It's not easy, and it can be extraordinarily frustrating. And to the extent that you're chasing new ideas, it can be even more frustrating. I remember early in my career, someone once said to me, David, you're a smart guy. Why are you studying like places? Like, what is that about? What does that have to do with criminology? You know, that was the kind of, you know, makes you feel a little bit bad. This is a pretty important guy asking me this question. But anyway, I don't know. I think that the being successful in academia is about having an inner voice of something you want to achieve and being strategic at the same time to the expectations of others, right? And you have to balance that. And recognizing that things don't happen all the time when you think they're going to happen, but keep pursuing it, keep pushing. You know, a secret of academia is to keep pushing. Like, don't give up. Like you know, if you think my ideas immediately got recognition in criminology, you're wrong. I've gotten a lot of recognition, but boy, there was a period of, you know, being out in the desert. Like, what are you doing? So, yeah, I think it's having that inner voice. It'll also help you because when you follow that inner voice, you won't be just doing it for other people, right? I'm not doing this for other people, to be frank. I'm doing it because I'm really interested. I think this could be an important contribution. I think it will improve society. And it's an inner voice who's pushing me in that direction. You can't ignore the outer voices, by the way. You have to get tenure, you have to play the game, so to speak. But that inner voice is really important, and be patient.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll give you a secret for students. Early in my career, you know, like I published a lot of articles in very good journals and books and very good presses. But, you know, like I've had a lot of rejections. Let no one tell you they haven't had rejections. And early in my career, you know, I'd send an article that I thought was really interesting on places or something. Someone would say, not an important issue in criminology, or there were a bunch of rejections. So I had this thing that I did with my granddaughter, Sarit, who's now a faculty member in the business school. I'd say, if I got a rejection, I'd go home and say, Sarit, we're going to go buy something. What should we buy? So every time I got a rejection, I bought myself something. The first video recorder, the first, you know, and I have to tell you, operant reinforcement works. You know, like I don't feel so bad when I get a rejection because I know now I don't do it anymore. But I knew that I was going to do something nice for myself to reward myself for the rejection.
Thank you. I've got one more question before I'm opening up the discussion for question from the audience. Is you have a long experience, you know, 50 years in academia, something like.
Well, 50 years is an exaggeration.
Exaggeration? Well, I'm counting 70s.
Really, in the mid-80s. Mid-80s. I am getting older, but let's keep that, you know.
You mean, I mean from the PhD or...
I got my PhD.
Okay. So 4 or 5 decades in academia, but both in the States and in Israel. And how can we build the institutional system to train the students better, quicker, and with less frustration, looking at across the years and the two institutional structures? Any advice? What would you change? Of course, $10 million for the criminology institute would help, but beyond money.
That's a difficult problem. I think there's been a lot of effort to try to streamline the process so graduate students finish more quickly. I'm not sure that's all good because it's moved people away from thinking about what they really, really want to do to a much more strategic approach. And that's necessary given the way academia is structured. I think that, to be frank, I think there's a general view of academia. Academia has gone in a very bad direction, or at least universities have. We are controlled by thousands and thousands of bureaucrats. Everything we do is watched. Every time we travel, it takes time to fill out those forms. Every time we do research, we got to deal with bureaucrats submitting it. It's become very, very difficult to get things done. And we have, there was a book published a few years ago that showed that in the US, at least, the number of administrators in universities grew like 2 or 3-fold, while the number of academics stayed the same number. This bureaucratic monster that's developed in academic life and has taken over academics, trying to fit everybody in a round hole, has been destructive to advancement of science, advancement of ideas, and also for students. We do everything today. When I was at Yale, there was an attempt to make you feel valued, and there were nice parties and things that were done by the university to let you feel you're part of something important. It wasn't all about constraints and supervision. And yeah, there's been a bad move. And unfortunately, academics have done little to battle it. Your life, David, and you're a little bit younger than me, but people in their 40s or whatever, they just, they think this is normal, spending all your time on stupid things and getting evaluated by bureaucrats on nonsense all the time. It's a very bad turn in academia, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree. I agree. I think that this is the problem, but I respect what you said now, and I want to ask people to
David, just think of it this way.
Intervene.
Let's say we spent a little less money on bureaucracy and a little more money on direct science. And I think this is examples of what you can do. What happens if we didn't try to fit everybody into a round hole? The extent to which the bureaucracy has taken over is a problem, and I think it's sad what's happening in the university.
Yeah, I see it in the States. I see it much less here. And accountability to what we do and the money we use is very important. I can see the difficulties in getting authorization for field experiments and so on. So getting out of the university and carrying out the research becomes more and more constraints. And from my point of view, it's a major issue. But I'm a scholar of regulation, and I tend to love regulation. Of course, I don't love regulation as regulation, and I don't hate regulation and regulation.
Well, the best regulation is regulation that's effective and at a minimum. But anyway, if we don't give 5 minutes to the students, won't have a chance to ask any question.
Let's open the floor for questions. Who wants to ask? We'll take a few questions, and then Galit wants.
I think there was a chat from Shmuel and from Yuval.
Yeah, Yuval and Shmuel. Yuval. Galit, you start and I will find.
Yeah, I'll start. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating. I love to see this link between criminology, geography, statistics. That was really cool. I think it's truly multidisciplinary in a sense. But I was wondering, I'm studying AI, and I was thinking maybe that was kind of the birth of predictive policing. Would that be a way to frame your research and maybe explain some of this amazing number of citations that I'm really envy at, I must admit.
Yeah, well, as I said early in my career, I wasn't getting many citations, so it takes time to work that up. Look, I actually chaired a panel or a workshop for the National Academy of Sciences in the US on predictive policing last summer, so I feel I know a good bit about it. I think that the kind of work I did is not really what's meant by the sort of predictive policing algorithms. It's my view of predictive policing is that it's gone a lot farther than it was capable of going, given the capabilities. And now with AI, it may be better, but there are lots and lots of ethical and other issues that go into this. As you've seen, in LA adopted predictive policing, then the guy who built it from UCLA, they were protesting outside his door because the data was secret. They didn't know what they were using to get the algorithms going and things of this sort. So yeah, my work is, I'd say predictive policing people think that my work has led to some of their ideas because you can't predict where But you might say that, the best prediction of a hotspot next year is whether a hotspot this year. So that's not very complicated. But it also suggests the police aren't always doing well. But yeah, I think it is. But those algorithms there needs to be a lot of work. One of the problems here is, someone develops new algorithms, then the police want to carry it out. Yeah, there's a lot of steps in between before you start implementing something that has impacts on individuals who live in these places.
Yeah. Thank you. And Yuval, please.
Yes, first, thank you, David, for sharing your great work. And it's really great to see that you're still excited after so much that you've done. Thank you for that. And I'm not a criminologist. I'm a public health PhD. Doing now a postdoctoral fellowship, and I'm just curious to know if there's any work or thoughts that you have about virtual, like cybercrime, because it seems that locations are more with the non-virtual crime, but how is this resonating with globalization, cybercrime, etc.?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of implications of a law of crime concentration for cybercrime. There's a problem in figuring this out in cybercrime because the denominator is very hard to define. Where it's how many sites are there? You can find the sites that have problems, but now how many sites are there? How many sites are there of a certain type, etc. So denominator has been a problem. As I said, I started working with a PhD student of mine doing cyber grooming work, and we found tremendous concentration of cyber grooming in specific places. So I think there's a lot of implications. I'll just mention, I have an ISF grant with Rotem Leshin and Leonard Snee, who's a medical researcher in Haifa, in which we're looking at genetic markers and biological markers and hotspots of crime. In other words, with an idea of trying to think about epigenetic changes. In other words, does living in a hotspot of crime lead to the production of certain hormones that are associated with violence, for example? Now, we don't really, the study we're doing is a proof of concept initial study. It's not a causal study, but it's comparing hotspots and non-hotspots in Tel Aviv. So yeah, this is how my career develops. I hear a lecture about epigenetics, and it says that, hey, an environment can methylate genes and turn them on. And I say, well, shouldn't hotspots or a certain kind of environment, do they methylate genes? So yeah, that's sort of how I get interest. And it's great when you succeed. It took me and wrote them like 8 years to succeed at getting grant funding for this study. A lot of people are very concerned about it, I think. They don't like biological studies in crime, etc. But anyway, yeah, I think there is applications that you were thinking about in cybercrime.
Good. And we have more questions. One from Shmuel here. It's written, what do you think about maybe the good and effective ways to prevent crime? Is it simply to improve social economic well-being, or more equality, less social disparities, or empower the police? I guess both, but what's the most important thing?
Yeah, look, let me start with something that I did a survey in Phoenix of people who lived in hotspots of crime, about 50 of them. And I asked them, do you want more police, the same amount of police, or less police? And more than half wanted more police, and 40% wanted about the same amount, and only like 7% wanted less police. So I think that citizens who live at hotspots are happy to see the police. And I think there's good evidence. And remember, the hotspots I'm talking about can have hundreds of calls to the police or crime incidents in a year. They're very difficult places. And especially when there's violence and other things, the police are particularly important. So it's certainly the case that hotspots policing is an important approach to doing something about crime and crime hotspots. Now, my work suggests that they ought to do it in ways that are more respectful, less violent, etc. And then you can train the police to do that so that they carry out their efforts in hotspots in those ways. Now, having said that, this NIH study I did which looked at social and health factors of crime hotspots, found that hotspots of crime are also hotspots of mental illness. They're hotspots of certain types of physical disabilities, some because of selection and some because of causation. They're hotspots of poverty and all sorts of problems. And my view is that we could do well by learning the lessons of hotspots policing and starting to carry out social and health interventions at micro-geographic places. Now, what's interesting is that I'm succeeding a little now. I have an experiment going on in Maryland about this. I had an experiment I started in Israel, but change of governments, and you know how difficult things can be in Israel. But there hasn't been much. In other words, when I propose a hotspots policing program, it's kind of not easy, but easier to get funding. When I start proposing, what are the other ways we can improve these places? Now, this is also asked about well-being. It's important to recognize that hotspots of crime are hotspots of other problems. And as a society, we probably want to address those problems as well. And we ought to be thinking about ways we can do that. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of thinking like that.
Thank you so much, David. I have dozens and dozens more questions. Some of them juicy, some of them more informative, but I will keep it for another opportunity. I want to thank you for excellent presentation, your generosity in your time and attention. Keep my best wishes for you is keep being proud of your students here and there. And I hope to meet you soon in another occasion here or physically at the university. Thank you so much, Professor wisebord.
Thank you for everyone participating. And great luck. Good luck. This is an important process you guys are doing.
Thank you so much.